What was your last name again, Ruby? Because that's
Belle.
what Bell. That's right. Okay. Because I was going to give
With
you
the
a
name.
new one,
Wait till next year.
and I had that written down, but I didn't. I said, was that it? Yeah. Well, it's 10:30, and it's time for brainstorming the human connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. And this is a um, interactive program. It's really set up so that people have a chance to interact, talk with each other, um, get to know uh, not only the guests but each other, and to bounce ideas. You know, it's brainstorming. That's what we do with brainstorming. We bounce ideas, but we give you a little bit of a prompt with some guest or some new ideas or different ideas or things we think that maybe should be discussed, but we don't hear them discussed very much. And today we're going to be talking about a very delicate but critical subject. We're going to be talking, in a sense, about courage. Okay, and not courage like going over the battle hill with with your machine gun or something in the face of enemy fire. Not that. That's not real courage. Most of the time, that's just adrenaline. But courage in the sense of getting over all the little voices in your head that say you can't, you know, that it's not for you, and we have lots of things in our culture that set us up to believe that we can't, and that it's not for us. And I think that as a society, we miss out on a lot of what people have to contribute to make us better people and to make our society better because we dampen the courage of those who could. And I think it's really important to sort of reassure ourselves or rethink that, to find that place that just say, well, okay, yeah, it's a little scary. I've never done that before, but I'll try it. And a lot of times we'll think, oh, our brains will tell us if you do that, something bad might happen. You know, and yes, something bad might happen, but if you stay in bed, something bad probably will happen. You'll get a heart attack because you're not moving around. It's like people that they're afraid to go someplace because somebody might shoot them. But you're more likely to shoot yourself in your house. More people die in their homes than outside. So statistically, you should just get out there and live. Do what you can while you can, or I always remember this one little girl who went to her grandpa's birthday party, and she said, "Grandpa, live till you die." And I said, that's probably the most, that's probably the most important thing a person could say, is live till you die. So that became my motto too. I'm going to live till I die. But today we have someone who has kind of experienced that, and she's going to be talking to you about getting over and how she, worked through that, and the machinations or whatever we want to call that churning to get to do something that's out of the box, out of away from her wheelhouse to become something else. We have Rubie Belle, and she is going to be talking to us today about a very special trip that she took. And I should say that, well, I'll let Rubie talk to you about who she is. Thanks, Rubie, for coming on and sharing your adventures with us. And I'm hoping that the people on this call will be excited and invigorated by the time we finish this. So let's start off by first talking about um, Rubie. Rubie, it's you. I think that we could have a song like that. That could be a song.
I think there might be one. Well, I was just sort of
So,
mesmerized listening to you. I don't even want to break the trance here.
yeah, yeah, right.
But,
but
well, gosh, I don't know where to begin, but thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful prelude. And yeah, I just have this saying that goes through my head a lot: fortune favors the brave. And I heard it a few years back and just really enjoyed that, that concept. And it just seems so true that if a person has, can get over their self doubts to take that first step on whatever journey, whether it's a new venture with a profession or relationship or whatever, or a physical trip, it's usually taking that first step that's the hardest. And then after that, somehow things work out. And a less poetic person once told me, well, everything works out, and if it doesn't, you're dead anyway, so then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's right. But
So
that's a
I think
given.
of
That
that
it's
too, but
yeah,
these
yeah.
little single lines that go around in my head. But anyway, I traced that back to Teddy Roosevelt and
Mm.
was crediting him for a while. But then I looked again, and it goes all the way back to Roman times, and who knows, maybe before that. But I think obviously throughout so much of our modern world, that has been something that people discover over and over again, that indeed fortune does favor the brave. And so, yeah, I just sort of, when I'm trying to get the courage to take that first step, I try to remember that statement, I
Yeah.
guess.
Let's start back up a bit and tell us a little bit about Rubie. Tell
Oh,
us,
you wanted
yeah, where were you born, and give us
oh, we're not going to talk about
your
her.
elevator speech, the Rubie
Well, I
elevator.
am Rubie Belle. A lot of people know me as Miss V, the Gypsy Cowbelle. I've been performing um, in and around the Rocky Mountain states for it's been about 30 years now. I'm based in the metropolis of Thermopolis, Wyoming, and I've been a proud member of the South Dakota Humanities Council. I didn't check the date, but I bet it's been at least 8 years. I've been on the Speakers Bureau and have really enjoyed a lot of great tours into South Dakota. I've enjoyed that partnership very much, having the opportunity to travel into the state both through the Humanities Council and the South Dakota Arts Council. So I want to give credit where credit is due on that. And I offer a variety of programs, mostly music based, sort of hopefully educational, most of which center around the American West, uh, a lot about homesteaders. And I also have a program on Amelia Earhart, and I'm bringing that up because I think it's so relevant to the discussion today. Obviously, one of the forerunners of courage, and certainly one of my biggest heroes in life. And I also have a kids program that I do, and that's probably the most popular show that I have been presenting in South Dakota in recent years, where I bring a bunch of homemade instruments and join the kids, or the kids join me in musical performances, and try to get them stepping out of their own boxes and learning to express themselves at early ages, hopefully.
Good. So, in our discussion about courage, we can focus, or I would like to focus on a rather recent exploration or adventure that you had. And we're going to be able to talk in a little bit in depth about it. But let's start off by talking about how the trip came about, where it went, where did you go, and then we'll get more into it. But how did you work? How did it happen that you took this trip?
Well, the trip uh, was, first of all, it was a camel trek through the Sahara Desert in Tunisia, and I was first inspired to go on a camel trek at least 30 years ago. As a young adult, I had dreamed of going on a long horse trip at some point. And it's, when you're young, you just think everything is possible in life and it's all just going to happen. So I better get going now. But anyway, a friend of mine gave me a book. She said, it's not horses, but I think you'll enjoy this book anyway. And the story was of Robin Davidson, who was the first person to ever travel across the Australian outback, a trip she did by herself. I think she's still the only person who's ever made that journey. And so she spent 9 months traversing Australia with her camels, and in the 70s. And that just, she and Amelia Earhart are like my two greatest heroines of this lifetime. And anyway, that just always stuck with me. I thought, well, always loved horses, and but the idea of traveling by camel just really struck me, and I had no idea how that would ever happen. So it's always been on my to-do list, and I was just sort of not aggressively looking for how or where to do it. But while working as a wrangler, I met a gal who told me about a company in Tunisia that was started by Juanita Reimer, who's a amazing, courageous woman herself. And she hails from Vancouver, British Columbia. And she sort of midlife packed up everything and moved to Tunisia and started this camel company, touring company. And when I read about her, her vision with Sahara, which is her company, I knew that was the right fit. And so after that, it was just a matter of corresponding with her and getting set up. And I was definitely a tourist, joined that tour company and went on a 2-week trek during COVID. And that was one of the biggest obstacles, was traveling during the second wave of COVID back in February of 22. And then I had so much fun. I went back last year for another 2-week trek. And then just this winter went for a full month in the desert. And so I just can't seem to get enough sand in my toes. So yeah, I guess, did that answer the question?
I think so. That will give us a start, give us context in which to think about this. But let's talk a little bit more under the hood. Okay. So you get to Tunisia, right? And you're going to meet up with this, and you meet up with this camel touring company. And often that's, when you're in a completely different space and you don't do a lot of international travel, that's often the best way to, like, at least get a lay of the land. What is it like? What's the culture like? What do the people do here? To just be in a position to just watch and absorb and observe what people are doing and how they are, so you can make your own context of how you fit in that space. But tell us about your first impressions of being in Tunisia, not necessarily this last time, but the first time you went to Tunisia. What were your kind of expectations? And then contrast that, if you would, with what you saw or what you experienced.
Well, I mean, I'm probably by nature a fearful person, so I did have a lot of fears and trepidations about going, um, that far away, and like I said, during that time, but also that part of the world. Of course, we're faced with a lot of, you know, preconceived ideas about danger in North Africa and the Middle East. And so I was very fearful. And I think one thing that really struck me was just the kindness of the people, and how sort of safe I felt, and I, not to be lulled into complacency, but that definitely was pretty early on, something that stood out, and there's a lot to be said about the landscape. It was just, the country itself was a dry, sort of a dry area, and I've been in enough parts of the U.S. that you can, I guess none of that was too earth-shattering, but the desert itself was, of course, stark. And I have spent a lot of time in remote places in deep snow country, and it just had that same sort of feel of just being surrounded by dunes. So instead of snow dunes, it's sand dunes, and I love that feeling of just being tiny within this universe. And I get that feeling when I stand out in the middle of those dunes or in the middle of a snowfield without any living souls around. What else was? I
Well,
don't know. I mean, I guess just
could
like
you
being out of the culture, everything is just different, and just how much that brings you to life. I guess that was the thing. I had traveled abroad a little bit when I was a lot younger, and just that mind blowing experience of when everything you look at is unfamiliar, and even not being in a country that doesn't speak English, but at least has our alphabet, and so you might see the odd word that looks a little familiar, but um, in that country, there might be a word that's written in French, which maybe I can figure out, but most everything is written with the Arabic alphabet. And so really there's like no touchstone to connect myself to as far as navigating around, and just how healthy that is. So it didn't matter what I was doing during the day. Like most of my day was just figuring out how to get to the next place I was going, like figuring out my tomorrow. And that was enough, just, I think how little it took to be entertained in a culture that's so completely different.
I think some of us refer to that as beginner's mind, when you go to a place and you have to think completely like a beginner, and you have to be able to be comfortable or find some comfort in I don't know, which is pretty hard for a lot of people to do. But it sets your brain to seeing things in a whole different way. And we depend, as humans, we depend a lot on our eyes, but we also depend on our ears. Can you talk a little bit about the sounds, if you remember any particular sounds that were new, either in your first experience in Tunisia or out on the desert where there's a whole different kind of sounds?
Um, well, two very different answers. So the sounds within before the desert was definitely the little mopeds, which was
Mm.
the primary means of transportation. Anybody who had something motorized was little mopeds. And so with that sound of the two-cycle engine just so loud, I have a hard time with loud sounds anyway. So that sort of consumed the streets, and that was different. And then the lack of any real like rules of the road, just like not much for like lanes or organized transportation.
Yeah.
So I guess that would be the standout new sound when I was there. But in the desert, and I will say so much of the trip was the desert, because I really was just trying to get there and maximize the time that I was in the desert, not the rest of the country. But the big takeaway for me was the lack of sound. I have this new saying that I like to repeat, which is we never know true darkness until we're in a cave, and we never know true silence until we're in the desert. And it would be so silent that my ears were ringing, and just how I love that so much. Because even like camping, which I have done a lot of remote places, we're usually by a creek, or you hear the rustling of the wind in the leaves, or coyotes howling, or some sort of background texture noise that's going on. And just in the desert, especially if there's no wind, it's just absolutely silent. And that was wonderful.
Mm, mm. We're gonna keep. There's a lot more questions I want to ask you, but I do want to make sure before I get into this next iteration of questions to give our esteemed panel a chance to ask you some questions too, because I can go off and then pretty soon they didn't get a chance. So, do you guys have any questions or comments or inquiries? Yeah, go ahead, Annie. You have to turn it.
Yeah. Hi, Miss V. So great to
Hi.
meet you. It's been forever. Miss V and I go back to when I was state folklorist in Wyoming. And yeah, I just am so excited to hear about your experiences. I talked to you right when you got back from the first one and haven't connected with you since. And now knowing that you've gone back twice more, and this is really part of your fabric now, and have woven it into your life like this is just fantastic. I'm just so struck when you say that you're generally a fearful person, because I know you as someone who is so brave. And it made me think, is fear relative? Is bravery relative? I mean, when I think about, you might want to talk a little bit about how you got to Wyoming and what you did. And that to me, so you going off to Tunisia and hanging out, with the Bedouins in the Sahara, just to me mirrors that experience of you becoming a homesteader in remote Wyoming. So I want you to tell that story just so people get a sense of who you are, and then a little bit about your drive to do this. I mean, we're innate to flee, right? And what gives us the capacity to be brave and to be less instinctive and more conscientious about our next steps, I guess. And maybe, Lawrence, that's for you to dig into. It's kind of a heady thing. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Well,
Rubie, I want you to tell the story of you arriving in Wyoming to homestead.
Well, first of all, so great to see you, Annie. I was so excited when I saw you pop up in the chat room there. So yay, good to see you. And gosh, homesteading, I always like to defer credit. I like being in the Sahara was very much following the Bedouins around, and the homesteading experience, which I started back in 1995, was really just following in the footsteps of a homesteader. So I took a job working at a dude ranch up in the Grove Mountains of Wyoming at a remote ranch. And it was just a summer position. But I hitchhiked out I was on the East Coast at the time, and hitchhiked out and found my way into this ranch. And so I just thought, well, after I finish in October, I'll hitchhike out. But then I got offered to stay and caretake for November and December. And then there's like 4 feet of snow on the ground, 25 miles to the nearest pavement by snow machine. And so getting out was not going to be easy anyway. And any thoughts of hitchhiking was completely not a good idea. So fortunately, 10 miles closer to the pavement, which was still 12 miles in from the end of the oiled road, was a little homestead ranch. And the people who started that back in the 1930s, Snook and Evelyn Moore, were getting pretty old, and it was hard for them getting by living up there without any plumbing or electricity and just snowbound for 6 months out of the year. So they were at the point where they needed someone to sort of come and look after them. And they had a fellow there, but he was getting pretty burned out on everything, after being there for a few years. So anyway, it just circumstances worked out that I just skied over the hill and ended up at this homestead ranch. And once I got there, it was, it was an easy fit, because it was just sort of what I had been angling towards. I liked the idea of being self-sufficient and sort of having a minimalist life. And I had lived in an abandoned house in a cave, and, these different little excerpts in my life. So when I landed at the homestead, it was like, it's everything I wanted, but it was really well set up. I mean, we had a creek and a spring and fed with horses. And so it was, just as soon as I saw them harnessing up the teams of horses, I'm like, all right, I'm not going anywhere.
That sounds terrifying to me. So that comes back, and that sounds just so incredibly brave in embracing the unfamiliar in a way that I find so admirable. So coming back to, maybe sometimes when we do something ourselves, we just do it. And then to have someone outside ourselves say, that was pretty amazing. You don't realize, they have the mindset that, that was, because we just do what we do and we're drawn to what we do. And I don't know, it's just this sense, this idea of embracing things that are potentially, really scary. It's an admirable trait. So on the outside, you don't appear fearful at all. I know you're very prepared, and you work very hard on making sure that, you're ready to perform or to speak or to travel. So I think that preparedness maybe also is part of overcoming fear.
Yeah, you could ask my my parents who witnessed a lot of. I was with them getting ready for the trip, and um, there was a lot of like research at home and looking into every eventuality. Much more I think than the average person would. And it was like I lived the whole trip before I went, and so I'm sure it was overkill and often unnecessary, but it did sort of, I think, it helped me just picture the flow of, visualize how I wanted things to go. And for me, the scary thing was never being in the desert. The scary thing is getting, you know, on the plane and crossing the pond and in country travel. And it's like I've never really hailed a taxi. I realized somebody was saying, "Oh, you just get a cab." Well, I've never gotten a cab, so it's like getting on subways and buses is not something that comes naturally to me. So to do that, in a foreign country was a big deal. And so I was trying to look up as much of that as I could. And in subsequent years after that first year, I've every year pushed myself to do more and more public transport. And it's maddening to try to go online and find the bus schedule in Tunisia because it looks very straightforward. Oh, this is great. I'll take the bus from here to here. And well, then you get there, it's like, no, there's no bus. That that doesn't happen. And there's no like warning that that's the case. You just everything online, it's in French, but I can like figure it out. Oh, this line here, and it just simply doesn't exist. And so yeah,
it's artwork.
yeah, just
That's
let
it's
go of all of that. I have this huge
yeah,
itinerary I print up with every like none of that happens that way. But
yeah.
the prep work does helps me, I guess, just to sort of
Yeah.
get my head in the
I,
game. And I'd like to
yeah.
be less that way, but not yet.
I think some people it really helps because it gives them anchor points and it gives them the sense
Mhm.
they like know they can have some confidence that they have some idea of what to expect. And other
Mhm.
people, they read it and decide that they can never do it. It's just, so I'd like to talk about, sort of the under the hood, Rubie, of like, like kind of personal challenges that kind of stepped you or threw you into the space of taking a chance, even the small chances that, pretty soon they look like nothing, but at the time they can look pretty big, you know. So can you point to any experiences that you've had that kind of gave you the sense that, yeah, I can do this, or even if it looks hard, I want to overcome that because I want to have this experience, and so that's the only way I'm going to have it. Some people just watch TV or something, but to actually get there, hear the sounds, smell the smells, touch the things, uh feel your adrenaline change when you have this new thing, that's different than watching it on TV or reading the spy novel. Can you talk a little bit about, the things that, the feelings that you've had, and maybe how you overcame maybe the resistance to a new experience?
Well, I guess I have, looking back, and thanks, Annie, for pointing out some of those things, because maybe sometimes I forget. Yeah, there have been a lot of instances in my life where I've been afraid and pushed myself through it. So I guess that builds on itself, and just remembering those feelings. And I could list a whole bunch of particular examples, but I think more important is just the idea behind it. You look back on like what you've overcome and like, well, if I did that, I can do this. So that's one thing. But for me, particularly with this trip, or probably with any of the bigger challenges I've had, is like a certain necessity like this. With a cost benefit analysis, there's risks that I don't really care to take. Like I don't want to ride in a car with certain people. Like it's not worth it to me. I'd rather stay home. Like I get really nervous in vehicles, whatever. But it didn't matter because I had to go on a camel trip. And so it's just like, I felt like it was very much my fate or my destiny to do this. And it had been something that I dreamt about for so long. And it just really felt like destiny, I guess is the best way to put it. And so, you know, whatever our belief system is, like, I feel like if you're pretty sure that this is what you need to be doing, then you're probably going to be okay doing it.
Yeah.
And so that's basically what guided most of the journey. But I do, you know, there were moments like when I got on that plane, it was like a whole series of steps to get from Wyoming to JFK in New York City to like get on the plane and go. And it's like, this is the point of no return. And there, you know, with the COVID, it was sort of a big thing because there are all these little tests in place where you had to test negative within every country had its own time frame and its own rules of like, you have to test within 24 hours of loading on the plane. And so even like to find a testing center in Tunisia to do this and how all that was going to pan out. And it's like, just because I'm getting over there, the bigger fear was like, can I get back? You know? So, but again, it just didn't matter because I had to go to the desert.
Right.
So,
well, a big part of the desert, especially in the Sahara, are camels. And I think that we would be doing our crew here at this service if we didn't take this opportunity to talk about camels, because they're not an animal that we see often. We can see them a couple of times here. I've seen them in South Dakota, but they're not something you just sort of like go out on the, you know, even in the Black Hills and just see them, you know. So maybe just to orient people, Colby, if you could like put up our some slides and just to give us some context here, we're going to run through at least a few of these slides, and maybe Rubie, you could tell us kind of like what's going on here and what kind of memories these slides bring back to you.
I just want to go back. So that looks like we're climbing up one of the endless dunes. This is just a very typical, this is what we did pretty much all day, every day for 30 days. And on this last trip I did, basically I signed on, again, I want to give a shout out to the company Sahara. And if I know how, maybe I'll type that into the chat box here. But anyway, she offers a variety of treks. So I signed on for an 8-day and a 15-day trek, but also because I did sort of get along pretty well with the Bedouins, and I've done enough horse packing trips that I felt like I sort of understood the ropes and the saddles and the gear, and would try to figure out a way to be helpful, and usually meant staying out of the way, but here and there was able to help them. So I guess they trusted me enough that I was able to travel with them without a guide for between the treks, which was a whole nother experience because there's no English speaking people at all for that. During the trek, there was a person who spoke English and Arabic. So anyway, I got sort of sidetracked there, but the longer, the 15-day trek follows the old ancient silk trade route, which you know more about the trade routes than I do, I think, Lawrence, with your experience in the Sahara. But anyway, how these guys know where they're going is like one of the most amazing things to me, because it just really does look like a lot of dunes. But on this trip, this last month that I spent in particular, I really tried to learn more about seeing the desert as they saw it, which means, identifying different dunes with different names. And of course, they have however many 40 different names for sand, and this kind of sand, and this kind of wind, and this kind of dune, and how they are able to orient themselves based on the vegetation, the kind of dunes, just, well, not just from knowing where they're going, because there's stories of them being able to tell each other like, oh, there's no trying to acquire like a herd of goats or something, and these guys travel to nomads out on the Algerian border. Well, we don't have enough goats, but if you go over here for 3 days, there's a guy over there that has goats, and they can talk to each other in a way that then 3 days of wandering through the Sahara Desert, they come to that exact spot where there's another nomad who has goats for sale. So anyway, I guess just in looking at these endless sea of dunes, I like to comment that there is, as you can see, there's a lot of vegetation, and there are differences that sort of, for the people who know that land, it's like we know the mountains, by different drainages or different peaks or land formations or whatever. They have different things that they use to orient themselves, but they do have an incredible sense of orientation. This is really fun because it's like a classic Bedouin stance here. They always stand like that, which is pretty fun. I don't know what there's just so much to say about all of these.
there is, and you've given kind of the 50.
This is interesting here. This is a couscous, which is one of the primary dishes in the Arab culture, and they cook it. It's not like we just sort of add water, but they're cooking it as from raw grains, and all of our meals were prepared on these fires, and fire was such a big part of the daily fabric. That even if we just stopped, if we had a cold lunch, a lot of times they build a fire and make like a hot meal. But even if we're stopping for a salad, they always have a fire just to make tea, and tea is such a big part of their culture as well. So 3 times a day, they'd start a fire, and then it would usually spread into like at least 3 different fires. There'd be a bread making fire. They make the bread right in the coals and the sand. And then the main fire for cooking the meal, which then became sort of the hangout fire after the food was done. And then a little tiny little fire where they'd make the tea, and that the tea would be sort of like the common thread throughout the whole evening of visiting, and just these long pours, these little tiny pots and a long pour, and passing these little tiny shot glasses around to each person for their glass of tea. And so
did they give you enough sugar?
there was plenty of sugar. No salt, but plenty of sugar.
Well,
indeed. So, and I am,
oh,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, you mentioned some very interesting points, especially about orientation and finding the way. And one of the interesting things is, it may seem like you're going in a straight line, but actually you don't. You're going in kind of paths of least resistance. So people know, like, well, it may look like if you go straight to that place, that's the quickest way. But they know that, okay, yeah, but you're going up and down hills, so probably going through this way and turn, east and go, and you have a sense of time that has nothing to do with a watch, because a lot of times nobody has a watch, but since we have this picture up there, can you tell us, because we could get back to this, but this is you mentioned that they made bread right in the desert. Can you tell us about, or what can you tell us about this bread making image here?
Well, I'll try to do a thumbnail version here. I do have a program on the Bedouins, I'm going to say, so I'd love to talk more about any one of these topics, but that require doing that formal show. But Cowbelle is one of their staples, and it's this made out of like a semolina flour and a regular wheat flour. And we pretty much have bread at every meal, at least for sure every breakfast. And the breakfast bread is actually, it does have a leavening in it. They make it the night before. And then they put it between, they have like a little metal plate and then this very crumpled metal top piece, and cover the whole thing in coals like you would a Dutch oven. But that's not the traditional style. Traditionally, the actual corpse millet, I'm probably saying that wrong. They put Muhammad Laid there is making his bread into a nice little flat circle, and then he's going to put it directly into the coals. And they have, they'll move the coals and the sand out until it's just the right amount of coals on the bottom, put the bread in, and then they'll cover it with just the right amount of sand and coals. And then they leave it for just the right time. And they sort of tap on it with a stick. And when it sounds just hollow enough, they'll flip it once for like 5 minutes to just brown the other side, pull it out, and then they dust it off with one of their scarves. And there's no sand, no ashes on it. And it's fabulous. And that is for sure one of the staples. And I always, want my fingers in everything. I want to try to learn as much as I can. And so, I think a lot of people do, let me try making the bread. So they let you sort of knead it, but they never really let me do the coals because, they don't trust me that much. But I did. I finally got the idea on this last trip. I said, why don't I make my own little Rubie loaf? So I made a very tiny little loaf and was able to do my own coals and sand. And, it was fine, but I wouldn't trust myself feeding the whole lot of them. So, and Muhammad Laid is, who's amazing. He just had this magic thing going where those who wanted to would go get firewood whenever we got to camp. And, he would just sort of disappear. And, we'd come back with these little bundles. There wouldn't, camps where there's very little vegetation, and he would sort of disappear. And I don't know what he did. He had some juju thing going on. He'd come back. So he was cut out of a different cloth.
but now, one of the things that you can see in this picture that it should be, let's say, pointed to just because it's something out of the ordinary that a person who hadn't been there might not be able to explain. And that is, you notice that people had on clothing that looked like they might have been cold. Can you talk about the temperature changes on the desert?
Yeah, well, as with any desert, there's no insulation in the sand. So just the big highs and lows that you'd expect, and in February, it wasn't terribly hot. There were, last year I was there into March, and it was just starting to get where it was uncomfortable, which means for me, probably touching on high 80s up to 90. But typically I think the weather is more like in the 70s and low 80s, just guessing, Fahrenheit. But then, in the evening, especially in early February, there were mornings where we had frost, and very cold as soon as the sun goes down, because just, again, no insulation at all. But one thing I learned, I had noticed before, that the Bedouins don't really shed their layers the way we do. I'll be bundled up, and pretty quickly as the sun comes out and we start moving, I'll start stripping down to maybe just a t-shirt or a lightweight long sleeve shirt or something. And they really don't. And I knew it was a thing, but I didn't really understand what it was. And because I was trying to get in, on this last trip, I was trying to sort of flesh out the information for the program that it's a new program I'm offering starting this year, debuting tomorrow, I should say. I was trying to understand a few more details. And so I guess what it is that they're really have like a fear of getting bronchitis. And so they think that if they shed layers, they're going to get cold and get sick. And I said, well, it's probably the fact that you're breathing in this sand, like, that might be causing that bronchitis. So, but anyway, it's just sort of an interesting thing, because they will wear their burqas, or these like long robes, far beyond. I'm like, how are you guys even walking? I'm just getting pretty hot, and they're still wearing their evening clothes.
Well, one more thing about the trip, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about camels. Can you give us some kind of impression? I mean, that's a very deep subject, I know, but just give us some kind of highlights about something you discovered or unique thing you discovered? Uniqueness of camels.
Well, they're not all like sweet and cuddly. They're pretty aggressive animals, and we use on the treks only male camels, and most of them are in the rut during this time of year, and so they're pretty dangerous, the big bulls. And you'll see some, I don't know if any of these pictures where a lot of them have muzzles on. The racing camels have been neutered, so they're less dangerous. But anyway, that I wasn't expecting. I sort of thought I'd be all like able to cuddle with the camels, and it's like huge mouth that can go around your whole head. And but also just the intelligence. They say their brains function, how they figure these things out, I don't know. But what I heard was akin to like a 8-year-old human. But of course, I think they're much smarter than people anyway, as with most animals. But they apparently have they never forget, so they respond a lot to how they're handled. And one of the main reason I went with Juanita and Sahara was because I had heard, firsthand that she was really valued, how the camels were treated. And these Bedouins were amazing. I mean, you could tell they loved their camels, and, they're part of the community. And of course, they do have to discipline them at times, or break up fights with sticks and things. But as far as just treating them like beasts of burden, that wasn't the case. Like they're definitely valued. But I guess, yeah, I mean, it is just such a vast subject. I don't really know how to say any more about it without going on and on. I think just being around them was just everything about it. I really had never been around them except for at a fair or something, going for a little ride, but they had live camels at this, it was a living nativity scene that I was like trying to give this camel a drink of water with the bottle. And so but yeah, other than that.
Yeah. Well, Colby, we can go back to our full screen now. But I want to give our audience and panelists a chance to ask questions. Sharon, you look like you've been chomping at the bit. Did you have a question? Oh.
Very discreet and trying to keep my mouth shut. Well, this is from I was in Morocco once, and with a group, and one of the features of this group is we're going to ride a camel into the Sahara in Morocco. But and I said to the program director, I can't ride, I have artificial hips. Oh, don't worry about that. So we go into the Sahara, and they don't know that I have artificial hips, and they never heard about it. I said, I can't ride a camel. So they put me in a pickup, a Toyota pickup with one of the Bedouins, and we were very compatible. And he is driving around the sands because if you don't know the route, you might go into a sinkhole. And I just really enjoyed that. I think since I'm not a horse person, probably enjoyed that more than the camel ride. And I learned one word that I have always learned if I've been in another country, and that is the word for thank you. In Arabic, it's shukran. No, I did get to ride and I was really impressed by the Bedouins too, because there wasn't a woman among them. They did all the so-called womanly duties. They made the meal, they set up everything, they cleared up everything. I thought, well, my golly, this is really a difference between the Bedouins and the more Arabic people. Well, probably.
And they are one of the tribes, and it always depends on a tribe. In my tribe that I grew up in, I didn't know men didn't cook until I was in my mid-20s, because I didn't know any men that didn't cook, whether they
Where is
were
this? No.
in the US, whether they were African American or Japanese or whatever. I
I
just
want to
didn't
go
know.
there.
Yeah, I just didn't know any men that didn't cook, and one of my regular chores was to do laundry for everybody in my family, and yeah, I just didn't know until I read it in a magazine that men didn't cook.
Good for you.
So yeah. So, but yeah, I always felt like that because that
Yes,
means, in fact,
absolutely.
all of the men, the firemen, they had like contests and calendars and cookbooks that they made. The most macho men in the community were firemen, and they prided themselves. You went to a restaurant, and almost every person there, all the cooks were almost always men. So it never felt like that was like a woman's job. That was like, what? Who came up with that? But that said, anyone else, because we're running out of time, and I want to give other people a chance to chime in here before we go on.
I have a
Vicky?
question. Yeah. I was looking back at the women that I know that have traveled, and I wrote down some words that I felt were applicable to me and my cousin in the Philippines. And I was wondering if any of these words were part of your travels. And the first one I wrote down was fleeing. And I didn't recognize that right away. The second one was searching. The third one was trauma, like childhood trauma. And then spiritual healing. Do any of those words match up to your adventures? I mean, they seem like adventures a lot of time, but it seems like for women, when they're traveling, they're going out of their realm of what they know. Some of these things are in the background. Now that you have to say something so private, I'm not asking you, but do any of them sound familiar? Am I wrong thinking that a woman to do these things may have that in the background?
What were they? Fleeing, searching, trauma, and
Spiritual healing.
spiritual healing. I think I would just have to say more spiritual growth.
Oh.
I mean, I think, and growth doesn't have to be different from healing, because I think probably one and the same, but I don't feel like I'm specifically trying to heal from a certain event in life. And like that woman I mentioned who walked across Australia she did a huge adventure, but she did sustain like a major trauma as a child. So I don't feel like I had that to point to, which is too bad, because otherwise I'd have a great book. But but anyway, yeah, I think just like pushing myself to do new things for the sake of learning and growing within this lifetime. And Amelia Earhart, one of her famous quotes was, "Adventure is worthwhile in itself," and I really think of that. Like it is just for the sake of traveling to just get outside yourself, see something different. And she also talked a lot about how we fear the unknown. And I have often, if something, a part of society bothers me, I have been known to go into that and try to understand it more. And I think with all of the, strife that's going on in the Middle East, I just was a part of the world. I felt like it would be good to understand or at least witness a little bit more than I had previously, which was not at all. So.
Annie, you had something you wanted to ask? I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt someone else. I've already had a chance to speak. So if there's someone else who'd rather drop in.
Anybody else?
Oh, this is Laniko, and I was just wanting to share a couple things.
Sure.
Kind of interesting that our hostess, or not a host, but our guest here is relating her adventures and all. But as I saw the scene of the dunes stretched across the image, the picture there, I couldn't help but think about some of the ways in which there are other parts of the world that are like that. And it was mentioned that there was a pathway through all of this, that the people knew the pathway and all this business, when actually I can't help but imagine the people who were indigenous to that area used the stars. They used the stars to navigate a lot of the landscape that we would look at and say, oh my goodness, how am I going to get to where I'm going? I'm in the middle of nowhere. And so I thought that thought came to me. And the second thought that kind of more or less was bothering me was that the fact that these people have had strangers come into their area. I couldn't help but think about some of my own family who have been preaching to indigenous people about safeguarding their cultural experiences. In other words, make sure that the tourists don't come in and trash up the area and then leave it a mess. And I was curious to see what our guest had to experience about tourists moving around in indigenous landscapes, because that's, and then the third thing I wanted to point out was I'm reading a book that I found most fascinating. It's called The Imperial Cruise, and it's about the whole presence of Teddy Roosevelt crafting his own courage. In other words, everything that he did was all about the image he was projecting and had very little to do with his own quote unquote courage, so to speak. And it's a fascinating book because it's loaded full of primary sources, and I think everybody would enjoy that. Get another perspective on courage, because we have a sanitized historical experience as public school students. And so to get underneath that and see how what these people were all about, I found that would be an interesting challenge for anybody who wants to read about what others thought about Teddy Roosevelt and his climb to fame.
Thank you for that, Lanico, because that is kind of what I was trying to get at today, is and it just kind of scratched the surface. So it's something we'll hopefully return to, and that is the whole subject of courage. How do we get it? How does it develop? What ways do people experience it in different situations? I would like to just go back for just a few seconds to talk about the difference between navigating by the stars and knowing the survival on the land, both of which indigenous people use. They do place themselves and can place themselves by the stars, but also, as I think Annie was talking about before, like there are things like, or maybe Sharon was saying, there are things like sinkholes. There are things like, well, where do you get firewood, and how much are you going, to get? It's things like, where are the watering holes, and how much water can we soak up and before we get to the next place? All those kind of things. That's like cultural wisdom. Rubie, I'll let you have the last word. We're down to 2
Yeah,
minutes.
because I do have so much to say on both of those topics that were brought up. So on the stars, that of course was the, always seemed like those stars in the sun. That's certainly how they're finding their way around. And I asked, like, pretty candidly, like, are you using the stars? And Monir, or the Bedouin who spoke English, he says, have you seen the stars or the sun in the last 3 days? Like, not once, did not see. And you think, oh yeah, well, you'll still know where the sun comes up. Well, you really sort of don't in a sandstorm for 3 days, And so the thing that's so amazing to me is these people have this, like, in their fabric, in their DNA, an internal compass, and it doesn't point to our magnetic north, it points to Mecca. Like, I didn't realize they have their own compass, and so wherever they are, they know where Mecca is, and their 4 points of direction are centered off of Mecca, not Polaris. So although surely they look at the stars, it is not, I mean, this is coming from the group I was with, it probably differs, but that they are, have a sense beyond that, beyond navigation, celestial navigation, that is enabling them to find their way around. And there was one guy among our Bedouins who was even more amazed. None of them would get lost, but he was above and beyond, and he always led the way. So again, that was my experience. And okay.
Unfortunately, we're at 11:30, but we want to pick this up. We're going to have you back, and we can talk more about Bedouin culture in particular. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week, same time, same station, for more brainstorming the human connection. Thanks everyone.